Hi guys, welcome to today's lesson. So we are going to be moving from male reproductive anatomy and now looking at the female reproductive anatomy. So we're going to do this in a similar way to the male system. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the major structures of the female reproductive tract, and we're going to start essentially from the inside out. So from where the egg is made up through where the baby comes through as delivery is happening. So we're going to start with the ovaries, and we're going to look at the oviducts, the uterus, then the cervix, then the vagina, and then the external genitalia, which is also known as the vulva. So when we're looking at the reproductive tract in domesticated livestock species, the reproductive tract actually lies directly beneath the rectum, and that helps us out when we are looking at female reproductive health for our livestock species. This is especially true in larger species like cattle, because we can actually reach into the rectum and feel that reproductive structure underneath. All right, so this is how we AI, this is how we check for pregnancy, this is how we look at the ovaries and make sure the ovaries are healthy. The reason we're able to do this is because of the physical layout. So up here at the top, you have the rectum, and then underneath, this is the external genitalia, this is the reproductive tract. So you can also see that the reproductive tract is suspended from an attachment to the spinal process or the lumbar vertebrae by this ligament here. Now, we're not going to talk a whole lot about this ligament because this is kind of an overview of female repro, but if you ever took repro as a course, you would learn a lot about these suspensions because there's more than just one. And this is essentially keeping the reproductive tract in place so it doesn't get twisted up and it doesn't get pinched anywhere, because you could probably tell that if any of these structures got pinched or twisted, we would have some pretty serious problems. So the layout of the reproductive tract is almost as important as the parts that are contained within it. So we're going to refer back to this picture kind of over and over again, and I'm going to zoom in on parts that are important to us, but this is kind of our big picture topic, all right? So the ovary is our first structure, and it is right here, this tiny little circle. Ovaries are going to vary in size depending on the species that we're talking about. So if we're talking about cattle species, they can range from the size of your pinky fingernail to kind of half the size of your fist. Ovaries in cattle vary quite a bit, and there's no necessarily rhyme or reason to the size of their ovaries. It just kind of depends on the animal. So the smallest ovary I've ever seen on a cow was the size of a grain of rice. And that is a very unusual size. And then the largest one I've ever seen was probably the size of a tennis ball. So they're pretty varied. And the ovary is considered what we call the primary sex organ. So that means that the ovaries are going to be producing one of our main hormones of reproduction. So remember, we talked about the testicles in the male. So the ovaries are the homologue. So they're the equivalent to the testicles. So they produce the egg, and then they also produce one of our major hormones of reproduction, which is estrogen. There are two ovaries, one on each side of the uterus, and those ovaries tend to release eggs in opposition, depending on the species. So like when we're talking about cattle usually have just one baby at a time, right? So they generally release one egg at a time, and their ovaries kind of alternate which one releases the egg. But that doesn't always happen. In fact, cattle actually prefer to ovulate on the left-hand side. So if you're standing at the back end of a cow, it's the left when you're standing at the back facing towards the front of the cow. So we're not really sure why this happens, but when we go to ultrasound or palpate the ovaries, about 70% of the time they will have their dominant, follicle and be releasing eggs on the left-hand side. I think, and there's a lot of thought about this, but I think this is because the rumen takes up so much of the right-hand side that sometimes that right ovary gets a little squashed, but there's no official science to say anything about that. But fun fact, most ovaries are left-handed. All right, so the main job, the main function of the ovary is to produce the egg. So this is the egg that's going to get fertilized by the sperm and eventually develop into a fetus and an embryo. It also produces estrogen, and this is done from the follicle on the ovary, which we're not going to talk a whole lot about, but you will see what follicles look like when you look at your dissection video. So the oviducts are next. The oviducts are these tiny little tubes that essentially connect the ovary to the uterus. And this is where fertilization is taking place. So that means that the sperm have to get all the way up into the oviduct in order for fertilization to happen. And there's a lot of really cool ways this occurs. One of them is temperature. So it's actually warmer in the oviduct than it is down here in the uterus. And as they get closer to the ovary, it actually gets warmer and warmer. So the sperm cells follow that temperature. And there's also hormones that are released. When the ovary releases that egg, hormones are released too, and the sperm like to follow that hormone signal as well. So there's a couple of really cool signals that bring the sperm, that guide the sperm, like, hey, up here, this is where the egg is. Surrounding the oviduct, or it's part of the oviduct, but it surrounds the ovary, is this really, really thin tissue, and it's called the infundibulum. Now they call it something different in your dissection video. I want to say they call it like fibria or something like that. But the technical term for it is the infundibulum, and it's this very thin membrane that is part technically of the oviduct, and it surrounds the egg and it catches it, so that when the ovary releases that egg doesn't just go wandering off over here into oblivion. It goes down into the oviduct where it's supposed to. So it's sort of like a funnel or a catcher's mitt, and it like funnels the egg down into the oviduct where it's supposed to go. So big picture here, the oviducts are the site of fertilization. This is a really excellent test question, so make sure that you write this down. Where does fertilization take place? It takes place in the oviduct. The infundibulum is a really long word, and I realize some of you are probably thinking, how on earth am I going to spell it? You don't have to spell it exactly right, but I do need to know what you're talking about. So just make sure that you can get it close enough. And if you break it down into little sections, it's easier to spell. So, do your best, but you will have to know what this is. So if you have to memorize it, go ahead and do that, but you will need to remember that term. Okay, so the uterus is kind of the main attraction, I guess, if you will. Most people have heard this term before, and this is where fetal development is going to be happening. So this is where that fertilized egg is going to house itself, and where the majority of the pregnancy is taking place. The uterus is also responsible for recognizing the pregnancy. So fun fact about the embryo, it's considered a foreign body by the maternal body because of the sperm and the DNA that's coming from the sperm. So technically, that embryo, that young embryo in the developing fetus, is a foreign body. And so the immune system is going to want to attack it. And so the uterus has to be able to make sure it recognizes the fact that this is a pregnancy, and it has to be able to kind of tame down the immune system a little bit and be like, whoa, 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 we don't want to kill this thing, we need it. So the embryo itself actually puts out a signal to tell the uterus that it's there and that it's not a threat. and it helps suppress the immune system a little bit. So fun fact about pregnancy, pregnancy is actually a war between two immune systems, the fetal immune system and the maternal immune system, and it takes place throughout the entire pregnancy. And early pregnancy losses usually take place because there's a problem here with this maternal recognition of pregnancy. Either the fetus hasn't put out enough signal or the uterus isn't capable of recognizing it. So a lot of very, very early pregnancies, I'm talking about where if you're talking about humans, the mother wouldn't have even realized she was pregnant yet. A lot of those really early losses occur because there's a problem here. So the uterus has what we call a tone, and I'm not talking about an attitude tone. I'm talking about the actual physical structural tone of the muscle. So you've heard of being toned, right? Where you build muscle and you have very well-defined tone to your muscle structure. That's more what I'm talking about, the tone of the uterus, okay? So that means that the feeling or the physical tone of the uterus changes under the influence of hormones. So under the influence of progesterone, the uterus is actually very soft. And it's this way to allow for the fetus to embed into that uterine wall. And it's to allow the least amount of resistance. Okay. And then under the influence of estrogen, the uterus is actually contracting and kind of hard. And it does this because the sperm need to be drawn up through the cervix up into the uterus. And so it has these little tiny contractions that kind of help that along. And it also helps bring down that egg. So, you know, during the influence of estrogen, the tone is a little bit harder. So if you reached in to feel the tone of the uterus under the influence of estrogen, you would definitely feel a harder structure than under the influence of progesterone. So the physical structure of the uterus changes during the reproductive cycle. So when we talk about the structure of the uterus, there are actually different types of uteri, and this is going to vary depending on the species we're talking about, all right? So the first one that we're going to talk about is a simplex uterus. So a simplex uterus means that it's a relatively simple structure. Simple, simplex, yeah, they go along together. So what's simple about it is that there's no uterine horns. So mainly what you have is a single uterine body, all right? So there's no division here like we see with some of our other species. So you just have this kind of big main body, and then you have the ovaries and then the oviducts here. All right, so we see this type of uterine structure in primates, so gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, things like that. And then humans also have the same type of uterus. The most common one that we see for our livestock species is called the bicornuate, and this means that they have two uterine horns that are very distinct and very well developed, and then they have a small uterine body, which is where both of the horns are connected. That's right here. So each one of these is a horn, and then this part down here, this is the body of the uterus, okay? And then you have obviously the ovaries on either side and the oviducts here, and then this is the cervix, right? So you see this in the cow and the sow, also in sheep and goats have the same type, and then the mare, so horses. Horses look a little bit different than this picture right here because horses, they actually have less uterine horn and a slightly larger uterine body, so they don't have, their uterine horns are not quite as well developed. They look more like the simplex uterus, but all of our livestock species have this. The sow actually has very, very long, very well-developed uterine horns, and that's because they have litters. And so they have babies typically on both sides of the uterus in order to sustain a pregnancy. They actually have to have a minimum of 3 fetuses. Any less than that, any fewer than that, and their pregnancy doesn't sustain. And that's because they need so much of that maternal recognition of pregnancy signal that just 2 or just 1 fetus isn't going to cut it. So the smallest pig litter you will generally see is 3. Fun fact. All right, the duplex uterus is actually super interesting because this is what marsupials have. So marsupials are like koala bears and kangaroos and possums. These are all marsupials, and they actually have two separate cervical canals that separate each uterine horn. So you could think of this actually as having almost two different uteri. So you have a cervix on one side, and this is all kind of self-contained over here. And then you have a cervix on this side, and this side is all kind of self-contained as well. So they can actually have two different pregnancies going on at the same time. So the pregnancy on this side could be older or younger than the pregnancy going on this side, and could be sired by different males. So marsupials are absolutely fascinating. If you are curious about how this works, you should look up how kangaroos have their babies, because sometimes they could have a pregnancy going, and then they could have a separate pregnancy going, and they could have a joey at the same time. So marsupials are absolutely fascinating creatures, and one of my favorites to talk about during an actual repro class. All right, so the uterus the horns of the uterus are attached to the oviduct. So kind of like you can see here. The oviduct, remember, is that tiny little tube, and then eventually that widens into the bigger tube, which is the uterine horn. All right, so this all here is uterine horn, and then you can't see it quite yet, but right over here is going to be the body. All right, so the main purpose of the uterus is for pregnancy. So this is where the fetus is going to be housed. It's going to implant itself somewhere in the uterine horn, and then it's going to develop its placenta, and then the uterus is going to sustain that growth for the entirety of the pregnancy. The uterus is also functioning as an endocrine organ of sorts here, so it's secreting hormones, and it's communicating with other endocrine parts of the body. So the uterus is actually quite a fascinating organ. It's very, very strong. It has layers of muscle, which we're going to talk about. So the uterus actually has three distinct layers to it, and they are all serving a different purpose. So the outermost layer is here. It's kind of this whiter color, and it's called the perimetrium, and it is a relatively thick structure, and what it's doing is it's protecting the interior of the uterus. So it's a kind of a tough outer lining, and it serves for protection. And then you have this middle layer here. It's kind of hard to see, but it's this kind of thick middle layer here. It's called the myometrium. The myometrium is actually the muscle inside the uterus, and what it does is it's responsible for contractions. So all of the contractions that are happening in the uterus at any given time are performed by the myometrial layer. All right, so it's really thick, it's very musculature, and it's kind of all along here. All right, and then you have the innermost layer, which is this really shiny, kind of watery looking layer on the inside, and that is the endometrium. The endometrium is this inner lining, and it's very glandular. All right, we talked about what glandular means. It means that this layer is going to be secreting things. So it secretes mucus, that really helps with sperm transport. It helps with lubrication of the fetus. This is also where the placenta is going to attach. All right, so there's a lot of functionality to the endometrium, and if something goes wrong here, if there's scarring or if there was an infection, then it can really impact how effective the endometrial layer is and affect how that animal can sustain pregnancy or not because of problems in the endometrium. When you have problems in the uterus, it's usually here in the endometrium somewhere. All right, so the cervix is next, and it is this part right here. So the cervix is, on a technical level, the gateway to the uterus. So it serves kind of as a biological filter. All right, it opens and shuts slightly when the animal is ready to be bred and ready to conceive, and then obviously it dilates significantly when that baby has to come through from the uterus. All right, so this will actually open really, really wide to allow for that baby. It'll stretch and thin out and allow for that baby to pass through. And during times of heat, during the estrus cycle, it opens and closes just very, very small. amounts to allow for sperm to come in. All right, so what the cervix is doing is it's actually protecting the uterus. So the uterus isn't necessarily a sterile environment, but it's pretty darn close. So we don't really want anything bad coming in here like bacteria or dirt or things like that, because what's happening in here right now, hopefully, is a pregnancy, right? And if anything gets in there, it can do very serious damage to the developing embryos. So the cervix is actually protecting the uterus from outside infections. So that's why it's closed up tight. And during times of pregnancy, there will actually be a plug secreted by the cervix that, you know, kind of just plugs up this whole tract here so that nothing from this side can come in. Because this side, we'll talk about it in a second, is the vagina, and there's urine here, potentially dirt here. And so we don't want any of that nasty stuff sneaking up in here and getting into the uterus and causing problems with the pregnancy. So the cervix secretes a lot of mucus, and during times of pregnancy, it secretes a really, really thick plug to keep everything out of the uterus. So this picture right here is showing the entrance to the uterus. I actually took this picture. This is the cervix of a goat. All right, and so this little red spot right here, you can see there's mucus that's being secreted. It's really, it looks kind of like snot, and that's more or less what it looks like, right? And then you have this opening right here, and this is the entrance to the cervix on this side. All right, so this is what I'm looking at. I have a speculum right here, and you can actually look at the entrance. And so if you were going to AI this animal, you would stick your AI pipette right here and stick it through the uterus right here, to the uterus right here. All right, so this is the opening. This is called the os cervix, the opening to the cervix. This right here is a picture of an actual goat cervix. So you can see these are not my hands, but I'm taking the picture. But this is an adult man's hands, and so you can see the size of the cervix. This little bit right here, this is the cervix, and the size of it is about probably the length of his fingernail, so probably half an inch. So the cervix of a goat is very, very tiny, and so getting your little pipette through there is a task. All right, so the vagina is the part people often actually get confused with the vulva. So the vagina is interior, the interior of the animal, and it is what's called the organ of copulation. So in natural breeding for sheep and goats and cattle, when the bull breeds the cow, or when the buck breeds the doe, or when the ram breeds the ewe, he's going to be depositing his semen right here in the vagina. All right, during natural breeding, this is where that's going to take place. So it's known as the organ of copulation because that's where copulation is happening. Okay. It's also serving as a pathway for birth. So when it's time for that baby to be born, it's going to come from the uterus through the cervix and out. This is going to be the passageway out to the outside world. All right. With our livestock species, this is also where the bladder is going to empty into. So there's a small little hole here. It's called the ureter. And it opens up here. And so this serves kind of like a flush way. So the bladder is actually a sterile area, and so the urine coming out actually helps flush out bacteria and dirt and things like that from the vagina. So the urine here is actually helping keep the vagina clean. The vagina is a really acidic environment, so this is one of the reasons we talked about that semen has to have buffers, because this is very, very acidic, because bacteria and fungi and viruses, they don't really like a strong acidic environment. So this is another way that the body is helping to keep itself healthy. All right, so flushing out with urine, an acidic environment, all of those things are really helpful to keep the body keep infection out and keep the body healthy. All right, so the vulva is last, and it is the external genitalia of the female. So it's the part that you see, which is right here. Okay, so this is a cow, and it looks very similar for most of our livestock species, and it is folds of skin kind of over the top of each other. And what this is doing is this is helping to keep things out. So if you look at where the vulva is with respect to the anus, it's right underneath it, right? So when a cow poops, what does poop look like? It's not a super solid thing, is it? It's kind of watery, and that's going to go down with gravity, right? So if this cow is pooping and she's got kind of loose stool, potentially, you know, that could all come in here. And so the vulva is kind of keeping that area closed off, and keeping things out. This is another reason why urine is so important to flushing this all out and trying to keep this area clean. So the purpose of the vulva is to protect the interior reproductive structures from infection. Main purpose there. Okay, so now we're going to kind of backtrack a little bit and go back to talking about some of the structures that you can see on the ovary. All right, so we talked about the ovary first, remember, and its main function really was to produce the egg, but it does have a couple of different structures on it that are responsible for that egg itself, and then it's responsible for supporting pregnancy. So the first structure we're going to talk about is the follicle. So the follicle is kind of a little blister-like, structure on the ovary. And again, when you watch the dissection video, you're going to see this a lot clearer. And inside that little blister is the oocyte, or the egg. So this is where the egg lives, is in that little blister. And that blister gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually it pops. And when it pops, that's what's releasing the oocyte, or the egg. We call that ovulation, okay? And then we have another structure called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is like an orangey yellow color, and it's made of really thick, what we call luteal cells that actually form from the cells that made up the follicle before. So these cells are undergoing like a Superman, you know, phone booth change and changing into a completely different type of cell. It's kind of neat, and it's the only time this happens ever in the body, where one cell undergoes a process that completely changes its function. And this happens regularly during the reproductive cycle of the cow. So corpus luteum is going to secrete what we call progesterone, and progesterone is that hormone that helps maintain pregnancy. Sorry, my dog is sneezing her brains out down here. So this hormone is critical for pregnancy maintenance, and if this structure, the corpus luteum, isn't functioning correctly and not producing enough progesterone, the pregnancy is not going to sustain. So this structure is not a super huge structure, but it is a critical one, all right? So without this, pregnancy isn't happening. And if pregnancy doesn't happen, so if the animal doesn't get pregnant, this structure will actually die off and restart the cycle. Okay, so we're actually going to stop there. Because we are going to continue talking about the estrus cycle in another video. So I hope you guys are having a good day, and I will be talking to you soon. Bye.